Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Cheryl Lebetovich and I serve as Senior Workplace Program Manager and Policy Analyst here at the USBC, and I'm so glad to welcome you to today's session. We're here for our Collective Impact webinar series, and it's hosted bi-monthly, and it's available free for everybody. Hosting you today for this call is myself, Cheryl, and Amelia Psmythe, Deputy Director here at the USBC. Next slide, please. So these webinars are funded through the generous support from CDC as well as the W.K. Kellogg Foundations. They're held every 2 months on the fourth Tuesday of the month from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And we bring together national and regional organizations, state, territorial, and tribal breastfeeding coalitions, and all organizations that are interested in collaborative work to share best practices and news about using the collective impact model for collaborative change. Next slide. This webinar is open to all interested breastfeeding advocates, and you can find at the link that you see here on this slide the topic and speaker details posted in advance of each webinar. You'll also be able to find the webinar recordings as well as the slides from all of our webinar series. So we encourage you to visit that web page and check out the recording from today after today's presentation as well as the slides. Next slide, please. To streamline access for this webinar, they're set up as a series. So you only need to register for the series once, and then you'll receive auto reminders of each session, which includes the topic and speaker details. We understand that you may not be able to attend every single session live, but the series registration is still going to send you these auto reminders so that you have easy updates on the topics as well as links to the live webinar and the archives. Next slide, please. And again, if you visit this URL, usbreastfeeding.org/collective-impact, you're going to be able to find archives of all of our past sessions. So make sure you visit this link and register for the series so that you receive all your confirmation and reminders and all that. To access this without the direct link, you're going to visit the web page here. You're going to go to our Learning Collaboratives tab and go down to the drop-down menu where you'll be able to see the Collective Impact Webinar Series tab. As you can see, this is the same drop-down where you'll be able to find access to all of our other wonderful webinar series. Next slide, please. During today's session, all attendees will be in listen-only mode, but we will host a Q&A session after the presentation. So please feel free to submit questions anytime during the webinar. Feel free to type those in so you don't forget them, and just pop them right into the questions box on your webinar control panel, and then we'll be able to flag them at the end of the presentation. If you don't see your webinar control panel displayed right now, it may be minimized. So you'll just have to click that little orange arrow that you should see in the top right corner of your screen, and it should pop out your control panel so that you can find the question in the chat panel right there. Next slide. If you have any audio issues, you have any technical problems, or you have any other questions during the webinar, just please send an email to office@usbreastfeeding.org. Our staff team is standing by ready to help you as best we can.
And I think that makes a handoff. All right, so thanks so much, Cheryl. Appreciate that. And this is Amelia Psmythe. I'll be your presenter today. I do have a little bit of a cough, so I'm going to dance my mute button and take sips of water or tea as I need to. So if there's pauses, that's what's going on. We're really excited to bring you, I think this is the 5th in the revamped 2019 Collective Impact webinar series. And the topic today is surveying the landscape for shared learning. And what we're going to walk through today is kind of the approach that USBC has developed over the last 5 or 6 years in how to kickstart collective impact initiatives. of course, acknowledging right off the top, there's many ways to do this kind of thing. It's just the methodology that we've been developing. And the steps I'm going to walk you through, we typically are able to at least begin in about 2 to 4 meetings of working with a group. So depending on how many people you are convening and depending on the complexity of the topic, you might be able to move through these steps faster or slower. The other thing I want to lift up is that we have a template worksheet that goes with this, and I will give you a preview of that at the end and talk a little bit more about that, and we're happy to share that handout as we go through. So the steps we're going to walk through today is getting started, surveying the landscape, assessing interest and capacity, mapping strategy ideas, conducting a root cause analysis, ranking strategy ideas, forming shared learning and group agreements, and then again, reviewing some of the facilitation resources that USBC has available. All right, so getting started. Probably most of you on this call are familiar with the USBC Strategic Framework. In today's call and the work that we do related to collective impact collaborative initiatives, we're really focused on the part of our framework that is centered in Goal 3. So this is related to articulating and advancing a national policy agenda, building public will and mobilizing funding, and the big emphasis today, convening stakeholders, guiding strategy, and establishing shared measures to support aligned activities. And then I think you are experiencing right now the way that USBC serves as a communication and networking hub for the field. And we also aim to support increased capacity and engagement of breastfeeding coalitions. And of course, this includes really more broadly the first food field. So as we have been investing in the experience and the training of forwarding collective impact initiatives, we lean into this logic model that we created a number of years ago called the Constellation Formation Pathway. And, there's a lot of words on this slide, but the main thing to point out is just, we have observed, many people have observed, right? There's different characteristics that a group goes through when they are formalizing what they're going to do together and how they're going to work together. And so this is really our attempt to describe how within the USBC network, that process of collaboration and support, what that looks like and what kind of markers we're looking for as a group goes from being kind of a loose dynamic network of organizations that have a common interest all the way into an organized and formally affiliated group that is meeting all the conditions of collective impact and has formal agreements with each other and with the organization. There's many different stages, between the two. Today, we're really going to focus on this blue row here called the Incubation Conversation, where a subset of organizations from a learning community are interested in exploring collaborative action. And so then we hold an incubation dialogue about the issues in the context to identify levers for change and available resources. So we're going to walk through that. So again, here's where we just start with the incubation conversation. You are probably all familiar with our engagement surveys, where we ask your organization to let us know of the various topics that are, up for collaborative action in the first food field. Where is your organization core or involved? And, the criteria for that, we're really looking for organizations that have, self-identified that they have real capacity around an issue. So that capacity could look like anything from, content expertise to people with lived experience, to funded capacity, to, network representatives that are highly engaged in a given topic. So through our engagement survey, we have aimed to identify the organizations within our network that are aligned with the key topics. And part of what we want to do in that process, though, is not just look for what you're telling us. We also do an assessment of missing voices so that we can recruit equity and other aligned partners who need to be there. Whether or not they are USBC members, we really want to, start with an assessment of who else needs to be at a given table. When we bring the call together, not everyone is comfortable with this or likes this, but, at USBC, where we're a virtual organization, it serves us really well to take notes in real time. And so it's a way of, an adult learning style where people can be both hearing things and seeing things. It's not everyone's jam. It happens to be something that works well for me. But I really encourage, people who are facilitating to explore if that's an option for them. And in the process of the introductions, one of the things they really try to lift up is not only, the name and the organization, but what is the organizational interest that brings a person to the table, right? And part of what you're trying to track is, that capacity and commitment piece. So you want to know, where are the organizations that are coming into that call? Where are they already, taking action or really paying attention to something that's developing in the landscape? And the advantage of taking notes in real time is that as you record the things that people on the call or at the meeting are saying, you can start to do some initial work of lifting up some themes. Like, oh, it's very interesting. Here we've got 3 different organizations that are involved in research on this topic. And here are, 4 different organizations that are really concerned about, a particular policy. And so you're already kind of blending in a couple things through this approach. One is paying attention to that people are coming as organizations, not as individuals. So there's some real capacity behind them. And 2, that they share some common ground aside from just the general interest in the topic. There's also specific interest in action they're already involved in together. So the next part of the process is surveying the landscape. And this often is also part of the first call when we're bringing people together. So I think of this as what is known. And so in the process of queuing up people on the phone, to be having a dialogue, these are the kinds of questions I'll ask. I'll say, okay, what's current or emergent in this topic? What's happening, right? Then, people lift up some things, some examples are written out here, like, oh, there's a working or drafting group on this. Oh, there's public comments that are coming up or open right now. Or maybe there's a publication or there's a campaign, right? And then I'll keep on saying, like, so what else is important for us to have in view, right? Like, and you're just really trying to keep on drawing from and lifting up the wisdom of the group. It's also a great time to ask, like, are there any hotspots we're tracking, right? Is there anything in this landscape and anything known within this topic that we have some concerns about? These are all helpful things to start to map out together. So then also really helpful on that first call is to have engaged the whole group in that assessment process of who else needs to be in the room. So, as the organizing, convening organization, it's important to do that assessment. But then when you get that first round of people, like, you've done your best, but then everybody can help think on this together. So what specific agencies or organizations are missing from the conversation? And it's really important here to include community voices. We have done a lot of our collective impact training with an organization called Tamarack that's in Canada, and they call this making sure that the group includes both context and content leaders. So notice we're not saying like something that is hierarchical, like experts and community or something like that. It's just some people are leaders in context and lived experience, and some people are leaders in content, and we need both at the table to have a full view of any particular topic. And as you begin as a group to map through and identify who else, what specific agencies or organizations you also want to have there, you can begin to map in what information or perspective do they hold on the topic. So it's kind of the cue of like, why is it important for them to be there? And then I encourage you not to get off that first call or out of that first meeting without having then a conversation about who's going to conduct the outreach for these partners that have been identified. Now, there's two pieces here in this early goal. So one is that you want to leverage existing relationships. And that's part of the beauty of all collective impact initiatives. You're asking people to leverage the resources that they have. And one of their key resources is existing relationships. But you're also setting a precedent where you're going to be a collaborative because you intrinsically distribute and share the work. So it's not just the convener of the meeting that is going to then hold all of the responsibility for making this thing work. So by the end of that first caller meeting, we really encourage that there be a plan, a shared plan about the action that's going to move this group forward. So it might be on the next call or part of the first caller meeting where you're going to be mapping through the outstanding questions that you have. Right? So I think of this as, okay, we've mapped through what we know. Now we're going to map through what we know we don't know. Right? Because ultimately, those questions, the answers to those questions are going to probably lead to more questions, and you want to be creating kind of a logic model for the group where they're really engaged and committed to a shared learning journey together. So some nice facilitation questions that kind of open this up is like, okay, given what we've heard, what questions do we have? So you track the emerging questions. So some examples of that might look like, all right, we have this policy that relates to our topic, and given that this policy exists, like who determines that policy, right? So that might be a research little piece that someone can take, right? There might be a question about, how a system works. So an example that comes to mind related to recruiting a content expert. Early days when the Lactation Support Provider Constellation was learning about the Affordable Care Act, we had a few different speakers from Georgetown University and Trust for America's Health come and speak to the group and describe some of the emergent things that were happening based on that policy. And there's been several other constellations that have done similarly, like Workplace Support Constellation has invited the Department of Labor to come and to provide some information about that larger system piece that then informs the group on how to keep moving. So I wanted to also really link up here that, this question and research answer kind of thing, that's the ongoing work of every collaborative. So again, you want to be tracking what the questions are, sharing and distributing the responsibility for who's going to seek those answers, and then continuing to monitor and record what the answers are, what the growing body of knowledge is for the group. So the next section is not on the worksheet that I'm going to show you a little bit later. And I chose this graphic, this head, heart, hands graphic, because this is something that as a facilitator kind of lives in your felt sense, if you will, of the group. So this is where you're assessing interest, capacity, and momentum. So think of it perhaps as a pulse check. So I've provided here the definition of the word synergy. The interaction or cooperation of two or more organizations, substances, or other agents to produce a combined effect greater than the sum of their separate effects, right? And that's kind of what we're about here. Like another way to say this is, as you're working with a group, is there a there there? So we're trying to assess, is there capacity? Is there timeliness? Is there momentum? And is there synergy? So a little bit, like to unpack a little bit what I mean by each of these. So when we consider capacity, you can be evaluating, are the organizations that are at the table or coming in, are they dedicated to this topic? In terms of timeliness, is there something going on that requires now, like action now? This group or some groups does not come together, is an opportunity going to be lost, right? Similarly, momentum. Sometimes there's not like a particular timely factor that is moving, but you definitely need to have like some energy and some enthusiasm in the group. Otherwise, you get into, what I call meeting for the sake of meeting, or the meeting dirge, where you're sort of like everybody's there because they feel obligated and things. Just, you're kind of going through the motions, but it's not firing. And so similarly, you want to be assessing synergy. And that feels like and looks like this shared sense that collaborative action is needed, and that together, if a collaborative could achieve the aims that they're starting to articulate together, that they could achieve something that individual organizations couldn't do. So again, this that the combined effect is greater than the sum of the separate effects. So as a little more background for part of how we think about this at USBC, you may have heard the term that we are a backbone support organization for the first food field. Right, so this means a lot of different things to us. Some is that we host and support networking and collaboration spaces on all different kinds of topics. Next week we have a networking advocacy call. We've got a lot of webinars, and we aim to make those as interactive as possible and really maximize our virtual workspace. We also have online workspaces with dedicated phone lines. So within our formalized constellations and our learning communities, there are workspaces that, where people, organizational representatives that have profiles in the website kind of come together and are populated inside of their online workspace, and it allows them to chat with each other, have a group roster that they can be looking at so they can contact one another. There's a place within that workspace to be sharing materials, uploading, downloading, having discussion threads and collaborative works together. And then we also provide dedicated phone lines. But one of the ethos of the way that we've approached this is that we really seek to decentralize leadership roles in order to build a leaderful movement. So, the USBC cannot possibly be the lead on all topics that are important in the first food field, nor would we want to try. So what we can do, and what we've tried to build within this model, is a mechanism to support other organizations to lead in the places and on the topics where it makes sense for them to do so, and where they have the capacity and the interest and the momentum and the synergy. So in those situations, we call those organizations stewards. So we do have a couple places where USBC serves as the steward, and our criteria for that are topics where there's funding and or strong capacity alignment with the topic, and secondly, where there's a need for a neutral facilitator. But, without those two criteria, those two boxes being checked, we're really looking to recruit member organizations to serve as the steward. So some examples of that are that the Physician Education and Training Constellation, the steward is American Academy of Pediatrics. On the topic of pasteurized donor human milk, the steward organization is HMBANA, the Human Milk Banking Association of North America. And on the topic of paid leave, the steward organization is Moms Rising. Now, in those cases, USBC still serves in a backbone support role. So we might help with meeting design. We might help with facilitation. We might help those steward organizations with schedulers. We might help them think through how to form the shared learning plan. But this is some of the structure that we have developed in order, again, to decentralize and share leadership roles across many organizations. So circling back to the sense of this pulse check, right, and where we're doing as a facilitator, convener, doing this assessment of is this timely, is there momentum here, and do we want to keep going? So one of the criteria for that can be seeing within the group that's here, or the group that evolves as you continue to recruit appropriate partners, is there a steward organization that is ready to lead in this space? So I'm listing this up because one of the characteristics that we have really aimed to build right into the infrastructure that we've got in our initiatives here at USBC is that, there's no shame in stepping back from a topic if you find that you've had a few meetings and there's really not the there's not the momentum, there's not the timeliness, there's not a lot of energy, it's not ready to go, then that can pop back into a learning community or be in a state of rest, and you can come back another time. We have one topic where we recently found that. I think it was probably the 4th or 5th or 6th incubation conversation, and suddenly wow, we had a steward, we had momentum, the energy on the call was really high, the ideas were flowing. It was just a very different experience than previous times over the last 5 years or so where we've brought that particular topic to get to together. So, you know, as I note here on the bottom, when the time is right, there's going to be ease, right? So there'll be eagerness. There'll be many voices. You'll see ideas and inspirations kind of flowing, and there will be volunteers. So when you get to those critical questions of who knows these people we've identified to recruit into the conversation, or when the moment comes and you're asking the question, who would like to research this question that we have, or who would like to go and recruit the speaker to come to our group, you're going to have hands raised and people in the conversation wanting to step forward. And again, that builds up this really nice floor right into the methodology and kind of the culture that you're beginning to build, that many hands make light work, that everyone there has something vital to offer and a role to play, and that there's no one organization that's going to make this happen. That would be kind of antithetical to the whole point. All right, so this next section is mapping strategy ideas. I'm going to pause for a drink of water. All right. So mapping strategic ideas, okay? So next stage for us, and again, sometimes this is the second meeting, sometimes this is not till the third meeting. We're going to facilitate a brainstorm of strategy ideas, right? So we've surfaced all these different things we know about the landscape and the questions that we have. Right now we want to think about, like, what would be some key strategy ideas that this group could undertake that would be what we call, awkwardly, a high-level lever for change, right? So what you're looking for in that is, what is the upstream policy system or environmental change that, you know, the group together could undertake that, if it was accomplished, right, there'd be this really positive downstream effect that would be magnified. So I'm going to give an example. There are so many. So one example is, so on the path of saying, okay, this policy exists, and here's the group that influences that policy or writes that policy. Well, in the process of researching it, we've had times where we've learned, like, well, actually, there's that group, but they are, you know, it's the funder behind that group that's dictating who comes to the table and how it's led. So in that case, the upstream lever could be, you know, getting to know that funder or that policymaker, right, and influencing the way that they are considering the formation of the group that then considers the articulation of the policy. So you see what I mean? Like, you want that learning journey so that you really have identified some of the meaty upstream pieces that are going to be difference making. And as the group goes through kind of this brainstorm process of the different kinds of strategy ideas they could do, you want to, you know, again, taking notes is recommended so that you can capture, like, some of what the discussion that happens, what are some of the considerations people surface when they consider that strategy idea. Note, like, the description of, like, what kinds of things might be involved. If there's any, like, key web links or, you know, citations, you want to capture those so that you're really kind of building out a little bit more than just a list, but like some substance behind each one, so that the group can really consider what they're looking at. So then it's also helpful to do, you know, once they're kind of, the ideas are on the board, kind of go through and ask, who needs to act and what do they need to do, right? So for each idea, is this something we can do within this group, or is this something that other organizations or institutions, like, are we trying to influence, you know, someone else, or is there a policymaker? So an example here, the Physician Education and Training Constellation recognized that part of what they wanted to be able to influence, right, were accreditation organizations for physicians. So those accreditation organizations for physicians were invited to come and make a presentation about the way that they work and what would provide meaningful influence to them. But those accreditation organizations didn't join the Constellation. They just informed them of what they do and how they work, right? Then the Constellation of physician organizations went about the business of like responding to that opportunity so that ultimately they could create influence to make change. So that's related to, in the consideration of what to do is, are you aiming to change something that already exists? Or are you about the work of developing a new policy, program, or resource? Getting all of this kind of noted and charted around each of the strategy ideas that are on the table is going to help in a later stage that we're about to talk about related to ranking the ideas. You kind of want it all on the board, though, at this point. Okay, once you have your ideas up, we recommend, for all our initiatives, we conduct then a root cause analysis. And, like the process of asking questions, root cause analysis is also never a one and done. So this is really an equity methodology where you're exploring these kinds of key questions. So this can be done in a very detailed way that can take a very long time and lead to lots of rich discussion. And the synthesis we have here, I think this is kind of we adapted with permission a root cause analysis tool from the Center for Social Inclusion to come up with kind of a facilitation light version that still can really help the group to be thinking through an equity lens. So here are the key questions. What problem are we trying to solve? Who is most marginalized by the problem and where are they? Who is doing well despite the problem and where are they? What are 3 to 6 institutions that are impacting the problem? What are 1 to 3 policies that are impacting the problem? And which of the institutions and policies impact the root causes of the problem? And is there anything we need to know about the history of the problem that must be addressed in order to solve it? So again, this process is not a one and done, but it is very helpful to do at this stage in the process because where you're going to go next is ranking the strategy ideas that you've mapped out on the table. And it's nice to have that equity lens really fresh in everyone's mind when you turn back to the board. And I've seen this make a profound change in what groups select as their priority strategies. So an example of a story from years ago, one of my favorites, is for a lot of years in the USBC space, there had been various stakeholders from nurse education and training organizations who would come together and try to think about how to make a difference in nurse education and training related to breastfeeding. And they had spent quite a few years, is my understanding, going back and forth between saying, okay, the lever for change is on the education side. We have to talk to the schools. And other people felt like, the lever for change is like the accreditation and testing organizations, because if it's on the test, then people will be forced to learn it. Kind of the difference of opinion, from my understanding, had created a situation where they didn't end up necessarily, making a lot of progress. Well, in a group using this methodology, when we conducted went through the questions for the root cause analysis together and turned back to our idea board, the list of ideas looked totally different. And the idea that rose to the top was the idea of impacting first, above all, the continuing education pathways for community health nurses. Because it was the community health nurses who are in the homes and in the communities of the people with the lowest breastfeeding rates. And so by doing that root cause analysis and really thinking through where are the gaps and where can we have the biggest impact and influence, it really changed the way that the group ranked the priority ideas that were in front of them. And it was pretty powerful, and it helped that particular group on that topic be able to make some progress. So again, as the group is thinking about this, in addition to the root cause analysis, it's good to set the parameter, again, of the expectations of like a high level lever for change, where people are working collaboratively upstream. You're looking for ideas that require collective action. You're aiming to create policy systems or environmental change that have a large downstream impact, and you're aiming to center equity. What I mean by that is, you know, actively, consciously, consistently be aiming to disrupt historic and or policy conditions of the past that are disproportionately impacting people today. Excuse me. When you put all of that together and in front of a group, those top 1 to 3 priorities, like I said, they really change what the thinking and feeling of what is the most important thing for us to do together really shifts, right? Once we are thinking about it in terms of what requires all of us and what makes the biggest impact in the most important places. Okay, take another sip of water. All right. So shared learning and agreement. This picture is the representatives, organizational representatives from the Physician Education and Training Constellation in the beautiful new EAP offices in Chicago that happens to be a LEED environmental certified building. Absolutely beautiful space. So creating a shared learning plan. So once the group has identified the top 1 to 3 strategies for collaborative action, the top things that they want to embark on. So again, like at this point in the flow, you might be 3 or 4 meetings in, again, depending on how many people you have and how complex your topics are. So looking at your priority strategies, you're going to, again, go through this kind of process of shared learning. So what is it that we know already? What is it that we need to know? How can we find out? And who's going to do the work? And it's like the little red hen, you know, who's going to bake the cake? So, you know, you really want to share that broadly, because that's part of the point of collective action. Everyone has something to offer. Everyone has a role to play. So prioritize the actions and identify the action takers. So the challenge is to distribute the work so it's collectively held, and that there's really, from the start, a shared ownership of the learning journey. So in a later webinar in this series, we'll talk with more depth about what we call the terms of reference. So terms of reference is a living document of the collaborative. It documents their strategy ideas, and it also documents their group ideas. So not only what are they going to work on, but how are they going to work together? And each group really has a different approach to this, but some of the common components of a terms to reference could include the articulation of their community norms, the articulation of their decision-making process. You know, in many cases, it's a modified consensus model. An articulation of how they're going to resolve conflict if conflict comes up in the group. A really thorny topic in some cases is in the case where there is, you know, a work product that's shared out of the collaborative. How would they publish, or what citations, you know, or credit would be given? So an example here is in the workplace support constellation. They have I think it's voting members, and then they have advisory members. And that's a way to include participation of organizations that for one reason or another, like either they don't do advocacy, or their participation is such where they're not going to be in a position where they want to be cited, or that membership would mean something much more complex in the context of that organization. So they participate, but they would not be cited, for example. So mapping through some of those things is helpful in a group. And then also the attendance agreements and the agreements related to what's expected of an organization that's a participant and what's expected of the representative that's a participant. And whatever other agreements a particular group finds they need can go into the terms of reference. So it's not a boilerplate thing. It's not a one-size-fits-all. As it says at the top, it's a living document. But what we're looking for are the minimum specifications of agreements that help the group to be functional without a level of detail that bogs anybody down. But, you know, there's that, you know, you want clarity, helps everybody on, you know, within an agreement, understand what's the role, what are the expectations, so we can be clear together and we spend more time having fun and getting things done when things are clear. So again, a terms of reference is another tool, facilitation tool we have, and we'll probably have a webinar diving more deeply into some of these components later in this series. So let's talk about the facilitation resources that USBC has available. So first of all, the strategic framework, I feel that that's a pretty interesting resource for coalitions in particular, right? Because part of what it identifies is, you know, what is it that a coalition does? What is the value add that a coalition provides to a community at any levels? That if the coalition wasn't there, you know, there would be really vital work that would not otherwise be done. You know, I think one of the things that makes it hard sometimes for coalitions of any size to find funding is the challenge of articulating what the value add is of the coalition. And so I think the USBC Strategic Framework, especially Goal 3, I think does that fairly well. And I think that there's been several coalitions that have kind of borrowed from that already, but wanted to lift it up. Within the Constellation Formation Pathway record, there's actually a second page of that as well that lists resources for every stage of development. But again, it's a logic model that articulates the stages of group formation. And I think that there's a lot of different ways that that could be applied, but I think it might be helpful as you're considering, you know, hosting your own groups or being your own backbone support organization for your community. If that's something that emerges for you, that logic model might be a helpful way to think about guiding a group process. The Constellation Pathway record, this is a worksheet that guides the facilitation process and has this double feature that it guides the facilitation process and it also records the group's progress in one fell swoop. And so a lot of the steps that just about all of the steps that I walk through today are built into that worksheet. And so if you use that as your template and you're taking notes in live time, you actually have a very ordered flow to follow with the group. And in the process, you also have a record of what emerged at any call or meeting. We also have a guidance for stewards or lead organizations about what kinds of things are involved in that role. We have a terms of reference template. Again, it's not one size fits all, but it can be a nice starting place. And then we also have roles that we play. So like I said, in some spaces, USBC serves as a steward. In other places, we serve as a backbone support. And our aim is to provide capacity building assistance to every level of the first food field. So you've heard learning communities are kind of the that loose network of organizations that are coming together out of shared interest in the topic. And you've heard that we are bringing together core and evolved organizations on specific topics. I think that we've got 3 different topics. I think community-based organizations, maternity care practices, and my mind is blanking on the third, and then a few more that are launching after that, where we're going to be bringing together and facilitating learning community conversations. And you will see us using a process similar to this in those calls. And we're doing that really intentionally, because as we provide backbone support to the USBC learning communities, we're going to aim to do two things at once. It's going to be kind of tricky, but I think also kind of fun, right? We want to facilitate the process that we described, right? All the way from the landscape updates through to the shared learning plans. We want to support these learning communities in doing that work. But simultaneously, we want to also have, it be like a forum for teaching and building the capacity of the field, so that the organizations participating in those learning communities are also equipped to serve as backbone support organizations in their domain, if that makes sense. So we want to provide capacity building assistance so that breastfeeding coalitions and others are supported in convening their own collective impact initiatives. Because again, USBC can't possibly be everywhere in all topics and all spaces, nor would we want to try to be. So as much as we can share with you what we've learned over the years of leading these kinds of initiatives, and you can, take that in and take it on to whatever extent makes sense for your group, and, come to the learning community and tell us all about it. We can be influencing one another and learning at the same time, which leads me to think the last slide about really co-creating this next stage of development. So collective impact initiatives are inherently ongoing processes of inquiry and shared learning. If the group stays together and they're staying vital, they're going to, every time they achieve a result or they pivot a strategy, it's going to be time to learn together again. And to be asking those questions: what do we know? What do we need to know? Who can teach us about this? Who's going to do which part? Right? So that you continue to learn and to grow and to lead together in places and spaces that are meaningful. So we've been implementing this Constellation model for about 5 or 6 years now. And up until this time, our work that, at least in this methodology, has been focused on the national organizations. And in the next stage of USBC development, as we launch these learning communities and provide backbone support to them, we're going to be co-creating with you and the first food field, and looking at some really key questions and things that we don't know yet, and I don't think we can know until we're in it together. So, for example, what does it look like when we convene groups who are working at many different levels of the system? Right? So when we have communities and states and regions and national partners all interested in a big topic like women who are incarcerated, breastfeeding women who are incarcerated. If you take a big topic like that and you bring in partners from every level of the system, some of the methodology that we just went over, some of that's going to change, right? Because there could be many high-level levers for change, right? And or there could be many different collaborative groups that larger conversation fosters, right? So we can't, like I said, I don't think we can know until we're in it. We won't know exactly how it works, but we're excited as a staff team to be working with everyone in the first food field who come to these learning communities on let's figure out together what's the next stage of possibility for this model and these mechanisms, and who's already doing collaborative work that can teach us, effective approaches as well. So, I'm going to see, Cheryl, are there questions in the chat box?
Hi, thanks so much for that awesome presentation, Amelia. We do have a couple of questions. The first one is asking about common pitfalls that tend to happen in these early incubation conversations, if you have any examples.
Mm-hmm. So I think the number one thing is if you aren't bringing together a really intentional mix of the content and context leaders right from the start, it really skews the conversation. You know, I often reference Kimmery Bug, Dr. Kimmery Bug from Rose, saying, you know, who's at the table changes the conversation. So making sure that, you know, you've got perspectives from different populations, from different races and ethnicities, different levels of the system, you know, policymakers with community members. Like, you need it all in order to really get those ideas out onto the table and not have things be skewed. So I think missing voices lead to missed opportunities.
Wonderful, thank you. We have another question here asking about whether it's expected for constellations to sunset once their goals have been achieved and what that might look like.
Yeah, I love this question because it goes right into that piece about, you know, momentum and timeliness and all the things. So yes, we have had times. So in fact, some of you may be familiar that in 2016, we had, gosh, I want to say 8 or so different constellation topics that had dedicated, you know, identified stewards and were kind of getting ready to move. And when the election happened, several of those organizations lost their funding, and that meant they didn't have the capacity to be stewards. And so in that case, we kind of took a few steps back in those topics because we had lost some of that criteria related to, you know, presence and momentum and energy and timeliness, right? So some of that capacity was suddenly gone. In terms of completing work together, yes, that too, right? So it could be that with some groups, like they finish one set of work and then it's time to go on to the next stage. So a great example of this is within the physician group in year 1, they did a project together where they wrote a model policy for training institutions, residency institutions, and healthcare settings related to accommodating lactating physicians or physicians in training. Then in their next year, year 2 of their work plan, they are working on what they're calling a culture plan. So what is it, the guidance that then wraps around the policy and makes it so it's not just a policy, but that lactating physicians actually get to access those accommodations. Because we all know policy and implementation, there can be a big gap if you don't have the culture that also makes it sync and makes it work, right? So in that case, they, you know, changed the end of one set of objectives and they found that there was a next step for them to take. In cases where there would be initiatives that fulfilled their mission, then yep, you could just dissolve. And that's also the beauty of having those agreements that are kind of the minimum specifications that the group needs to be functional. It's not a contract together with each other, but it is like clear working agreements. You come together when there's momentum and you let it breathe and rest when you're complete. Any other questions, Cheryl?
Yeah, we have a couple more. A couple of comments about how to really make sure we're maintaining and centering equity throughout the conversation and throughout the collaborative process, going beyond just inviting folks to the table, but really making sure equity is centered throughout the process. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that to share?
Yeah, I think it's who's at the table, but also the selection of what is done. You know, if you're the group, hopefully you are guiding and leading the group to select activities that are going to be addressing and alleviating some of the historic harms and limitations that are currently in the system. That's one piece. I think also the dynamics of the group are critical, right? So we can't change the outer world into a better version or vision of what we want to see if we're not living that in the experience of how to come together and be in one another's care. And that relates to, you know, the first webinar in this series really talked about the emphasis on trust and building trust and moving at the speed of trust and making sure that people are not only at the table, but are really supported in having a voice, being heard, seeing the influence of their contributions, and being supported to participate, even if sometimes the content or the dynamics are difficult. And I think all of those, like there's kind of that inside strategy so that you're within the group, you're really caring for one another and leading with an equity culture. And then in the external work, really very intentionally looking to ensure that the activities that are selected are things that actually make a difference in an equity frame.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a question. Does USBC have any tools or recommendations for assessing the capacity of an organization?
Ooh, we don't, but we should. You know, some of the thoughts that come to mind as you ask that, I think I mentioned earlier, sort of me thinking out loud, like capacity means a lot of different things. So it might be funded capacity. It might be like who's in the group already. You know, like, so if your coalition has a lawyer who knows a lot about workplace, you know, if there's a way to engage that lawyer in the workplace learning community or something like that, that might be capacity. So someone who's like in the know. It could look like activities that the coalition has done, you know, in the past or present. There's a lot of different ways to assess that, but we don't have a tool for that, but it may very well exist. That's a good research question for us.
This is Kinkini, if I can jump in. And we have a page that we are developing right now. The USBC does a lot of individual TA to coalitions on coalition building, on strategy development. And we do have a tool on organizational capacity assessment. That page is not public. We are tweaking it and getting sure that we have curating the best resources on it, but the entire section is all about how do you build coalitions, how do you recruit members, how do you build your strategy, how do you do all the kind of nuts and bolts work of getting your infrastructure in place. But I will post that along with the CI webinar handouts over there. So we should be able to have something, but if there are others who are listening in and you all have a good organizational capacity assessment tool that you use, please share. We love to highlight and, you know, use our group to share and resources that we found. So I will share that on the webinar page. And if there are others, please share. Thanks, Amelia.
Yeah, we actually have a comment. Maybe board source would be helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, and thanks, Kinkini. I had been hearing the question as specifically like capacity to participate in a collaborative, but you're right. Like we're all about the capacity and building capacity within groups as well. So great questions and resources.
Amelia, we are at the top of the hour, but we have two more questions that are juicy. Do you have a moment to continue?
I like juicy questions. Go for it.
Okay. The first question is how to explain to funders that you're focusing on collaborative work. So what you produce might be different than what they're expecting. Any advice there?
That's a super juicy question. Yeah, and so I think that even if, you know, the term collective impact is unfamiliar to funders, I think most funders will understand words like leveraging resources or building synergy around shared capacity or being on a shared learning journey to create change that is beyond what single organizations could do on their own. Related specifically to the question that you can't tell the funder what it is that you can't promise what it is that's going to come out. That's actually a really strong and important kind of almost like a boundary or parameter to set or expectation to set with the funder really early on. Like the things that, as the convener, the things we can promise is we will have a very thoughtful and intentional process about how people are invited and recruited and added into the group. We will, have a focus on, XYZ topic that is important for the following reasons. You can say, we believe that this is a large-scale problem that's going to take many different organizations coming together in order to address. You can, ensure that equity is going to be part of both that inside and outside strategy, right? But with all of that, that the facilitator or the convener can kind of set up, it's going to be ultimately the wisdom of the collective that is going to, lead to the identification of what exactly is done. So I think if you're approaching the funder who's unfamiliar with collective impact and kind of the mechanisms of how this would work, you would say, like, we're going to bring together the people that have the wisdom in terms of context and content around this topic to be able to collectively determine the most important things that could be done to help change things in the most important places and ways. What's the other juicy idea or question?
The last one is asking about whether USBC ever supports or helps to create connections between constellations or learning communities and different collaborative groups.
This is another great question. So when we first launched this model, and it was all conceptual 5 or 6 years ago, there was a lot of concern that we were building silos. But I think over time we've been able to show that, we are consciously, participating and attending in all of these spaces and looking for the opportunities where there can be collaboration across topic areas. So one recent great example is the Physician Education and Training Constellation. This last year did a collaborative piece with the Lactation Support Provider Constellation. And some of the work products from that collaboration will soon be published. And then in this coming year, that culture plan piece that I just talked about, the Physician Education and Training Constellation is going to collaborate with the Workplace Support Constellation. So absolutely, it actually is really attractive also to funders. I think when you can say, look, we've got these two different tables that are already convened, are already moving, and we can bring those two groups together and make great things happen out of the expertise we would leverage from both tables.
Wonderful. And thank you everyone for sticking around for an additional 5 minutes. We will have seen a couple of comments that folks are having a little bit of trouble downloading the handout. So please rest assured we will post those to the web page. Again, the link is usbreastfeeding.org/collective-impact. You'll also be able to find the webinar recording as well as the slides. Thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again in a couple of months. Thank you, Amelia.
Thank you.